Hello and welcome to this video on lactofermentation. This is a different way to approach fermentation. It differs drastically from what we've shown you with yeast fermenting sugars into alcohol. Rather, it is an example of something like kimchi. It is a means of preserving food. By no means has our list so far been exhaustive. We are simply adding one more item to it, lactofermentation. If you have heard of this before, you might immediately think lacto as part of the name refers to sugar from milk. Unfortunately, in this case, you would be significantly off the mark. It instead is a reference to the bacteria responsible for this particular form of fermentation, Lactobacillus. The various species of Lactobacilli are not uncommon, and in fact you'll find them in many places: plants, environmental surfaces, and even your GI tract. They are considered the good bacteria, sometimes arguably called a probiotic. They're described this way because they're considered salt tolerant, and unlike other species that are largely pathogenic, that are not salt tolerant, these can be used to convert sugar in food into something useful. Primarily, we're talking about converting sugar into lactic acid. You may know the term lactic acid, particularly if you're more involved in exercise than is good for you. Lactic acid is generated in the body when it's attempting to convert the available energy sources in the body, when there's no oxygen available, into usable energy. This generates lactic acid, which is then responsible for pain in your joints. The lactic acid producing bacteria, or lactobacilli, are so named not because they themselves are known for their lactic acid, but rather because they were first identified in milk fermentation. It was here that they converted lactose and the other sugars in milk into lactic acid. As we pointed out though, they do not solely rely on lactose, but instead can convert many sugars into lactic acid. The lactobacilli are one of the more common bacteria found in yogurt cultures. The yogurt culture is particularly noteworthy as the taste of the lactic acid, that harsh bitterness that is common to naturally occurring yogurts, is from that lactic acid. One thing that you should be aware of is that unlike a yogurt culture, the ideal temperature for most lactofermentations is not the warmer above room temperature situation of around 25 to 30 degrees. Rather, it's slightly lower at somewhere between 18 and 22 degrees Celsius. For those of you who insist upon the barbaric imperial system, it's 65 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. You can, if you have time, significantly lower the temperature down to as low as 12 to 13 degrees Celsius or 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This will take longer to ferment, but it does work. The lactofermentations are argued as being one of the better foodstuffs, that they're healthier and better for you. Many people argue that the process of lactofermentation means you're not eating harmful bacteria on your food. Admittedly, if this were the case, you'd have food poisoning regardless. But they also argue that the bacteria does not enter your digestive tract, and therefore you're not going to get sick that way. They also argue that the lactofermentation, and particularly the lactobacilli, when it's introduced to the GI tract, is going to help you consume food because it helps to break it down. We should debunk some of these common myths before getting into the details of just what is happening and how to do it. First of all, most food poisoning and similar does not occur because you have consumed food that's been prepared properly. This means if you've made your lactofermentation wrong, you're going to be in for a very hard time anyway, and spend most of several nights praying to the porcelain god. Second, those who develop gastroenteritis and similar infections that lead to gastric issues are likely to have so due to an opportunistic infection. This means the bacteria that are in your gut are going to have the same effect, whether they're friendly or not, if they are given an opportunity to infect you. Finally, as far as digestion goes, lactofermentation does not provide any bacteria that should not already be in your gut. This means that consuming food that has been fermented this way should not make nutrition any more available than it would otherwise be. You're not consuming any more unhealthy bacteria than you would have been anyway, and ultimately it boils down to the chances of you being infected depend on how well you handle your own food, not what food you are eating. This, of course, skips over the fact that you do process all of that food in your stomach, where you effectively combine it with a large amount of acid and melt it down to chyme, which is then digested. The bacteria that survive this process of being churned into chyme are generally more resilient regardless. Now that we've debunked some of the myths associated with lactofermentation, let's look at how you can do it. The simplest ways to do it are to take clean glass jars. You can use either mason jars, food-grade jars such as those for a Fowler kit, and several others. If you're more dedicated to this process and have both the time and resources, it's worthwhile investing into equipment that can be fitted with an airlock. An airlock is going to allow you to have an oxygen-free environment, or at least one that's far more easily achieved than some of the other methods available. The most common method to achieve an oxygen-free environment is to immerse whatever you're trying to ferment in a brine solution. This is sometimes called a saltwater solution. In order for this to be the case, you need to not only ensure that you completely fill the container up with as much material as you can ferment as possible, but also that it can't move freely once it's in there. This is because most fruits and vegetables will begin to try and float to the surface. This means that they're not going to ferment because they're outside of that brine solution. One option is, as said, to fill the vessel you're using as much as possible, packing it in tightly so that nothing can float. The alternative is to try and weigh down the contents of the jar. There are things called fermentation weights, although this is yet another item that you would need to clean, sterilize, and reuse on a regular basis. We propose it's far more convenient and effective to simply pack your lactofermentation vessels more effectively. If you aren't going to use an airlock, and that is a perfectly viable option, you will need to take a few extra steps. This has various names for it, and in simple, that what you're going to do is try and prevent gas buildup to prevent the brine from overflowing. This is, as said, given various names: burping, gas release, and so on. This is done quite simply. You open the lid of the jar just slightly. This lets air flow out because it's at a higher pressure inside the vessel than outside. Then you close the jar off. By that time, you shouldn't have had anywhere near enough air go back into the jar that it allows the thing to become aerobic again. The problem with this is rather obviously that you are going to be handling and fiddling with these jars. That means you are possibly going to be introducing pathogenic bacteria to it. This is one risk when trying to do lactofermentation. Circulating the air this way can possibly make it contaminated and therefore turn the food bad. Most brine solutions use something between a 1 and 5% salt solution. Anything above 5% is going to be unpleasant to start with, but also entirely inhospitable to bacteria. In fact, most bacteria can't survive anything above 4%. Staphylococcus aureus is possibly the only exception to that. You'll find that most of the time you're focusing on something around a 2.5% brine solution. This means you'll get good flavor, but also safe food. The exception to these numbers is your lactobacilli. Now, you can keep pushing the salt levels above 5% if you're looking to store this for longer, or are concerned about more resistant bacteria. The problem is, once you hit about 10% salinity, you're going to find that lactobacilli cannot produce lactic acid. Therefore, you're not going to get the change in the pH. No change in pH means that you don't get the stability in the food, so you aren't going to be preserving it. But you may also be creating other problems in that the bacteria you've introduced in the form of lactobacilli become pathogenic. The brine solution is probably the most common. There is another though, and this is called dry salting. Dry salting is combining your salt as a powder or crystals with sliced, grated or cut up vegetables and fruit. This is more commonly done in kimchi. As you draw out the liquid, because the liquid will follow out of the fruits and vegetables towards the salt, it creates its own brine. If you're of European descent, you may be more familiar with this when it's used for sauerkraut. Generally speaking, you're looking at a similar percentage of salt as you are for a brine, somewhere around 2.5%, 5% if you're looking at something that is going to be a little more questionable, and a maximum of 10%. This will be 2.5%, 5%, or 10% of the weight of the fruit or vegetables you're preserving this way. While by no means a perfect demonstration or explanation, this should give you a good place to start if you're trying to get into lactofermentation. Start with something simple and predictable. There are pre-made kimchi sauces available. All you need to do is prepare your vegetables in preparation for adding it later on. That means you can establish very quickly both what you like as far as taste goes, but then modify it with the sauce. If you're looking to start from a very puritanical position of doing everything yourself, then perhaps sauerkraut is a better option. Either way, lactofermentation is perhaps not as healthy as claimed, but it is an effective and convenient way of preserving food. It's also a nice and interesting example of bacteria being used in a way that benefits us, that isn't just turning sugars into alcohol or fuel. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.